My talk will be something of a change of pace in terms of what we've heard today. I'll talk about the residential sector, nothing about the commercial sector. I'll also talk about the United States only. And the content of my talk will be more in the line of, you might say, political economy or even regulatory anthropology. Some general remarks about the question of the role of the government in promoting end-use energy efficiency in buildings. From an academic and policy perspective, in the last several decades, there has been an extreme amount of attention in these circles to the normative aspects of this topic, of what the government should and shouldn't do and how it should do it. A lot of attention to what the fundamental policy and economic rationale for efficiency promoting policies and programs is or should be. The distinction between so-called market barriers to energy efficiency and what economists regard as market failures, and the relative merits or not, depending on one's point of view, of technology standards such as efficiency performance standards compared to price policies such as externality taxes. Concurrently, at the same time, the efficiency potential studies that some people have come to know and love have occupied a very prominent, increasingly prominent role in the policy world. The 2007 and 2009 McKinsey studies are only the most recent examples. The most recent one that Ernst showed today. These kinds of studies have been conducted for several decades now, and they serve essentially as what evidence in practice, in a way. They're de facto what the evidence, such as it is for the possible consequences of the policies. But from what I would call an evidentiary perspective, there are still very basic questions about this stuff that have not received much attention since the heyday of efficiency, the prior heyday in the 1970s and 1980s, such as what data do we have to analyze these policies, actual empirical data, not potential studies, and at least not solely simulation studies. What do we know about the actual accomplishments, the results of these policies and regulations in practice? What standards of evidence should we expect apply in the academic world, in the policy world, among governments? And can they be improved? And if so, how? Right now, it's very hard to address these questions. Fortunately, in the last half decade or so, there has been something of a resurgence of empirical work on energy demand and energy efficiency by primarily economists. The papers, some work I would cite, Gillingham et al. From a retrospective study of US efficiency policies. Our colleagues' papers, which had an enormous impact, I think, on the way these issues are thought about. Professor Alfhammer and his collaborators at Berkeley, also including Professors Foley and Wolfram, Palmer and colleagues at Resources for the Future. I should also mention Professors Kahn and Costa from University of California, Los Angeles, who are here in attendance. Very innovative work has started to appear on this empirical about how the efficiency policies and programs behave. So this comes at an opportune time because we live in interesting times. Under the current administration, in the last 2 years, federal policies and programs and regulations to promote efficiency in buildings have received greater attention, support, emphasis, and funding than at any time since the 1970s, and possibly even more than at that time. A rough estimate, which I made a couple of years ago, is that I would estimate that the federal funding for efficiency and renewables to increase an order of magnitude between the previous and the current administration. Now that includes the so-called stimulus funding. We have our own Recovery Act, which is a one-time surge of money, but nonetheless, tremendous new resources have come into this. So one of the centerpieces of what the United States is currently doing is a suite or a portfolio of new policies and programs to promote energy efficiency retrofits in single family in the United States. That generally means detached dwellings of middle class, middle income, or middle or higher households. Now, this is noteworthy because for many years, the government has primarily emphasized energy efficiency weatherization programs and so forth for low-income households, single and multifamily. So what the government is doing and what states are doing now, de novo or increasing their previous efforts, are explicitly addressed to overcoming 3 so-called barriers, as I mentioned before, that are thought to prevent widespread retrofits from occurring to date, and also the emergence of a market for those. And they are that consumers lack accurate and reliable information on the benefits of retrofitting, both the energy savings benefits, their cost benefits on a life cycle basis. They lack access to financing to defray the upfront costs of making the investments, of making the retrofits, and there's workforce supply issues. There are insufficient workforce trained in this to meet demand. So it's held that these barriers systematically prevent homeowners from undertaking retrofits that would otherwise benefit them privately, not just in terms of the social benefits of reducing emissions and so forth, but privately. Some of the elements, the highlights of the new federal initiative are providing homeowners with accurate and reliable information. For a key effort here is, as we've heard about, analogous home labeling, energy labels for homes. Similar to what we've had for years, or better, hopefully, than what we've had for years on appliances. And effort to reduce upfront costs and to facilitate borrowing by homeowners, municipal energy financing, which is, Scott Henderson talked about this morning, a residential version of so-called PACE arrangements, energy efficiency mortgages, where the borrowing costs can be rolled into, integrated with mortgage loans, more state funds for funds available to loan money at reasonable interest rates to homeowners who want to do the retrofits. Now, the rest of my talk, the essential content is that the United States has run this experiment before, and there is a profound lack of institutional memory about that. And at least because I'm a researcher, I think it's worth looking back. So the paradigm that we're talking about, I like to use that word, of analyzing end-use energy efficiency in this way emerged in the late 60s and 1970s, indeed in Berkeley, the University of California, and the Lawrence Laboratory, to a great extent, primarily but not exclusively by physicists. So the approach was and continues to be based on the conjunction of a combination of the first and second laws of thermodynamics. I don't know if there are more than those, but that's the ones they always quoted, and discounted cash flow analysis or life cycle cost analysis, which we're all familiar with. In the 1970s and into the early 1980s, as this methodology started to be applied, analysts started finding many instances of what we think of cost-effective investments in efficiency, both certainly in residential homes as well as commercial buildings, that were unexploited. And so the improvements to thermal shells, the retrofitting, the ductwork, the better windows, ceiling, and so forth were all examples. So it was inferred, starting back then, this is now in the mid-70s when papers started to be published about this, that consumers and firms lack information on the benefits of such investments and the financing to undertake them. There was also mention as early as the mid-1970s about this so-called split incentives problem, landlord-tenant. So very aggressively, that was the energy decade, some of us are old enough to recall. States and government put into place a range of legislation and regulations to promote efficiency investments based on providing information to consumers, in this case, and creating better financing opportunities. So there were several pieces of legislation passed. First, the National Energy Policy and Conservation Act of 1976. It's followed by another act actually preceded by one in 1975. And President Carter's National Energy Plan of 1977 included requirements or provisions for residential energy audits and financing mechanisms in the form of rebates, loan programs, and tax credits. President Carter's plan explicitly established the goal of retrofitting 90% of all existing U.S. households by 1985. So here are some key examples of what was implemented. The so-called Residential Conservation Service, or RCS, started around 1980, was a federally supported and utility-based program, gas and electric utility-based program that combined federal tax credits, a secondary mortgage market for efficiency conservation loans, and a so-called integrated approach of free home energy audits, guidance to customers, expert advice in securing financing, and in identifying qualified folks to sell equipment, buy equipment, and to do the retrofitting. So the RCS fell significantly short of what was expected, what had been projected for it specifically and for this class of policy in general. An estimated 2 to 4% of eligible households received audits during the first 3 years of the program. The Department of Energy's sponsoring agency's previous pre-program estimate had been 14%. There was evidence, a number of studies of selection effects quite pronounced in who was participating, with more participants tending to be disproportionately affluent and educated. And on the basis of program results through 1983, it was estimated that if the program would continue to 1985, the original time horizon, it would reduce national energy consumption by a fraction of 1%. This is in comparison to, at that time, approximately 23% of US national primary consumption went into the residential buildings. There were several very intensive demonstration of quasi-program and research projects in the 1980s. I'm going to mention two that are well known. The Hood River Conservation Project in the state of Oregon sought to achieve 100% adoption of retrofit measures in a small residential community. The city government, the participating utilities, non-governmental organizations were all involved in a variety of information campaigns and so forth to get people to do it. Retrofit measures that were undertaken as a result were fully covered, where they were paid for by the utility and or the agency. I don't remember the exact number. They didn't achieve 100% adoption. They achieved some large number, but the average estimated savings pre-post of 14% across the households that participated were less than half of what had been predicted. They found, unexpectedly at the time, substantial and unexplained energy use variability across the households that were involved, and about 20% of what had been predicted in savings lost due to the so-called rebound or take-back effect. Another example of a project like this in the Pacific Northwest provided free audits and zero-interest loans to about 7,000 to 4,000 households combined. Here again, there were large consumption variations that could not fully be explained, and the average savings over the 3 years of the program were about 2/3 of predicted. Some households saved more energy than had been predicted, but some households, about 10%, actually increased their energy consumption. Now it was the case that the Reagan administration came into office in 1980 and tried to put a stop to all of these things, but nonetheless, a lot of programs continue that were not under federal auspices, particularly in utilities, smaller scale programs. And there was an extensive, and I intimated this at the beginning of the talk, at that time there was a very active research enterprise in laboratories, agencies, and universities to do evaluation research on programs of this type. And in general, this literature found penetration rates tended to be quite low. Penetration rates in terms of the eligible number of households in any given instance. On average, 5% of eligible households, and energy savings per home also tended to be modest in most cases, around 5 to 10%. Certainly there were exceptions. Selection effects were found pretty regularly or conjectured by the researchers, and so people who tended to invest in the retrofits tended to be higher income, more educated, inclined toward conservation and energy efficiency, and also having previous experience of doing retrofits. And consistently in this literature, unexplained variation across households is found and emphasized. As far as financing, several analyses found that financial incentives generally increased in a given, certainly utility program, increased program participation over information-only programs, but penetration rates still tended to be low. So from, say, an average of 3.5% participation up to around 5% between information only and information with incentives. In one study, it looked at a number of meta-analysis. Also, it found that relatively few single-family retrofitters in the utility programs needed or used financing. They paid cash. And there was some suggestion in the literature, although it was never fully investigated, that utility financing in a lot of these cases simply displaced other sources. People may have borrowed money at zero-interest loans or low-interest loans from the utility to finance, but it may be that that simply displaced money that they had available to them from other sources that could have been used anyway. This has happened recently in Berkeley, in fact. There was also a great deal of social science research at the time, involving not just economists as well as anthropologists, social psychologists, and so forth. There was the gap between what had been expected of these policies in the 1970s and what actually was achieved when they started to be implemented drove a lot of this work. The National Academy of Sciences, which is our sort of premier scientific body, produced several authoritative meta-reviews of the work in conjunction with reviews of program literature in the mid-1980s. And one quote of these I like to highlight stated that federal energy information programs have proceeded from implicit assumptions about the way information works. And those assumptions are fundamentally wrong. To paraphrase, the idea that giving people information that makes sense to an engineer about BTUs, costs, and benefits, it simply didn't take with most homeowners. And the programs that were based on this paradigm, the National Academy recommended strongly that communication research, psychology research, and so forth be taken into account. Since then, there hasn't been any real change in the policy philosophy, and the results have sort of mirrored those of the early days in the sense that energy and cost saving have in many cases achieved, maybe on average achieved when it's been undertaken, but at modest levels. Okay, so if you remember the McKinsey cost curve today, the big negative effects are not there. Maybe small negative effects have been achieved in a lot of cases. In other cases, there are some examples of programs. One I would mention is a combination of home energy ratings and energy efficient mortgages was a big pilot project was undertaken in the 1990s. These projects have yielded very limited results. And again, I will highlight to come back to the variation among individual households in energy consumption, including households with similar or identical dwellings in some cases, continues to be observed but not explained. So I think there's a rich set of inferences that can be drawn from this. And I've just given a sketch, but I'll highlight some, particularly in light of our focus here on real estate financing investment. So I think it's very clear at this point, all else being equal, there is no large latent demand for energy efficient homes that can be elicited by providing information and financing to homeowners. This experiment has been run repeatedly in many places, and the results tend to be what they are. There's not a groundswell of enthusiasm anywhere that I've been able to find. But in regard to, in the context of CO2 abatement, large is the critical thing here, okay? Modest results, there's nothing bad, there's nothing wrong with those, okay? Shaving several percent off the growth in energy demand is a fine energy policy goal. But energy and climate policy are not interchangeable or equivalent here. For the kinds of reductions that we're seeking in order to forestall the risks of global climate change, the modest increments are insufficient. That is the key message here. In the present context, I think there's a need to conceive and create new products and services involving residential energy, markets for delivery, as well as policies that may be needed to support them. I think, to use a cliche, more of the same or the status quo is not really going to yield substantially different results than it's yielded in the past. But this now is certainly political economy, politics. There's a fundamental dilemma here, which is the efficiency policies and regulations that we are talking about here, code standards, utility DSM programs, rebates and whatnot, they originated and continue to be promoted, certainly in the United States, in part as a way of meeting energy environmental goals without imposing direct visible costs on consumers. They're not radically different from any other public policies, but in terms of the private sector's, I would think, role in this, if it's no cost, what are the profitable opportunities and what are the drivers of innovation? This, I have never understood how something could be already free if you just did it, but there are huge gains to be made by other parties from doing it. Maybe in the discussion section I will say one thing about CFL light bulbs in that regard. I think that energy information and measurement technology may be what we like to call game changers, but they need to be cleverly used. So I think a very important application in terms of risk analysis, there's a need for, business, and certainly research need to rigorously analyze the actual risks and rewards of residential energy efficiency. What does it actually yield in large samples or larger samples if you really do the measuring correctly? We don't know. The variation among households that is problematic and vexing for policies, certainly for regulatory policies, may be the key to a business opportunity. If there's a market, if there's variation, a lot of different needs that can be met. This kind of information, which is not presently available to us in the US, I think might serve to identify the possibilities for new green financial products and markets in residential real estate. Energy efficient mortgages they're fine. I don't see any reason to think they're going to get more traction than they've got in the past. I should mention that a residential version of the PACE program that Scott Henderson talked about this morning was implemented around the country, and it was halted by the federal authority, Federal Housing Authority, I believe, for imposing, among other things, imposing insufficiently analyzed risks, and for the, what's the jargon, the lien. So that has been, that effort needs some new thinking. Thank you.